Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Thomas O'Brien found the jacket at the base of Bright Angel Trail, torn in ways that suggested the wearer had been pulled in 5 different directions simultaneously. He knelt beside it, his knees pressing into the red dust that coated everything in this part of the Grand Canyon. The fabric was high-end Gore-Tex, the kind serious hikers invested in, purple with yellow accents. Women's size small. The tag inside read Sophia Carr in permanent marker, the letters slightly faded but unmistakably deliberate. People who labeled their gear like this knew what they were doing in the backcountry. What they didn't do was tear their $1,000 jackets into geometric patterns that formed symbols Thomas couldn't quite focus on. Every time he tried to trace one with his eyes, his vision slipped sideways, landing on a different configuration entirely. Coyote probably, he muttered, straightening up. His radio remained silent on his hip. No signal this deep in the canyon, which was why he'd hiked down alone after the 3rd missed check-in from Phantom Ranch. Standard protocol when a solo permit holder failed to report. One ranger makes the descent, assesses, calls for backup if needed. Thomas had been with the National Park Service for 11 years. He'd seen dozens of missing persons cases. Most resolved themselves within 24 hours. Turned ankles, dead phone batteries, hikers who simply underestimated the canyon's scale and took an extra day getting back. The ones that didn't resolve happily usually involved falls, heat exhaustion, or, very rarely, something more sinister. He'd never believed in the more sinister. Not the supernatural kind, anyway. Human evil, sure. He'd dealt with enough domestic situations gone wrong, enough suicide jumpers, enough drug runners using the backcountry as a transit route. But the stories the old-timers told, the ones the Havasupai and Hualapai Rangers shared during joint training sessions, the whispered warnings about things in the desert that weren't quite coyote, weren't quite human. Bullshit. All of it. Thomas folded the jacket carefully, noting how the tears seemed to have been made from the inside out, as if something had pushed through the fabric rather than ripping into it. He photographed it with his service camera, a Nikon D90 that the park had finally upgraded to in 2012, making sure to capture the unusual damage pattern. Then he slipped it into an evidence bag and continued down the trail. Sophia Carr, 28 years old according to her permit, wildlife photographer from Flagstaff. Her itinerary had her spending 3 nights at Phantom Ranch, then 2 more nights camping at Bright Angel Creek before ascending via the North Kaibab Trail. She'd submitted a detailed route plan, listed emergency contacts, even provided references from previous backcountry permits in Yellowstone and Glacier. The kind of hiker who did everything right, which made the jacket all wrong. The temperature climbed as Thomas descended, the October sun hammering down into the canyon with the kind of intensity that turned stone into griddles. His camelback was already half empty, and he'd only been hiking for 90 minutes. He checked his Garmin GPS, elevation 4,800 feet, still another 1,000 to go before reaching the Colorado River. The device's battery indicator blinked amber. He'd charged it fully last night. At the next switchback, he found the first footprint. It pressed into a patch of sand that had accumulated in a depression in the trail, preserved by the overhang of rock that had shaded it from yesterday's brief rain. Human, barefoot. The toes splayed wide in a way that suggested running, or perhaps something worse than running, fleeing. The arch was pronounced, the heel strike deep. Thomas photographed it, placed a scale marker beside it for reference. Then he noticed the second print, 3 feet ahead. Same size, same depth, but this one showed claws. Thomas crouched lower, his knees protesting. He was 43, in decent shape, but feeling every year of it in his joints. The print was clear enough. 5 toes, still human in configuration, but each ending in what looked like a curved talon at least 2 inches long. The sand around the print showed additional disturbance, as if the foot had twisted mid-stride, the claws dragging furrows as weight shifted. "Mountain lion," he said aloud. his voice flat in the dead air of the canyon. She stepped in a mountain lion print. Coincidence. But there were no paw prints, just the two human prints, one normal, one clawed, and then nothing. The trail turned to solid rock for the next 100 yards, offering no further tracks. Thomas stood, wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and kept walking. His radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. Just static. No voices. The canyon played tricks with radio waves, bouncing them off stone walls in ways that created phantom signals. He'd learned to ignore it years ago. The static resolved into a sound that might have been words, might have been wind, might have been his own breathing amplified and played back to him in a voice he almost recognized. It cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of his boots on stone and the distant roar of the Colorado River somewhere below. Phantom Ranch appeared around the next bend, a cluster of cabins and a small lodge nestled at the bottom of the canyon where Bright Angel Creek met the river. The complex looked deserted, which wasn't unusual for late October. The season was winding down. Most tourists had retreated to the rim where temperatures stayed reasonable. Thomas approached the main lodge, noting the open door that should have been closed. Park property, even remote facilities, followed strict protocols. Doors stayed secured unless actively in use. "Hello?" he called out, stepping into the relative coolness of the building's interior. "NPS? Anyone here?" Silence. Not the empty silence of an abandoned building, but the held breath silence of something waiting. The lodge's main room showed signs of recent occupation. A half-finished cup of coffee on the table, still lukewarm when Thomas touched it. A paperback novel face down on the couch, spine cracked to hold the place. The radio equipment on the ranger desk was smashed, the microphone torn from its cord. The base unit showing what looked like teeth marks in the plastic casing. Thomas's hand moved to the canister of bear spray on his belt. His pulse, which had remained steady through 11 years of encounters with wildlife, unstable visitors, and genuine emergencies, finally began to accelerate. The logbook on the desk showed Sophia Carr's check-in from 3 days ago. Her handwriting was precise, almost architectural. Arrived 14, weather clear, water sources good. Proceeding to Bright Angel Creek Campground 10:18. Below her entry, someone had drawn a symbol in what looked like dried blood. The lines formed a pattern similar to the tears in her jacket, geometry that refused to stay still when looked at directly. Thomas photographed it. His camera's LCD screen showed the symbol clearly enough, but when he looked back at the actual logbook, the pattern had shifted slightly, the angles different. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes. Dehydration. He needed to drink more water. A sound from the kitchen area, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across tile. Thomas moved toward it, bear spray in hand, his other hand hovering near the radio that he knew wouldn't work, but that still provided psychological comfort. The kitchen was empty, but the back door, which opened onto the service area behind the lodge, stood open. Beyond it, the narrow space between buildings lay in shadow despite the midday sun. Thomas could see drag marks in the dirt, 2 parallel lines about 3 feet apart, leading away from the lodge toward the creek. He followed them. The marks led to a storage shed 50 yards from the main building. The shed's door hung open, revealing darkness within. Thomas pulled his flashlight from his belt, a Streamlight Stinger that had never failed him, and clicked it on. The beam illuminated Sophia Carr's camera equipment first. A Canon 5D Mark III with a 100-400mm lens, still attached to a carbon fiber tripod. The camera was on, the LED screen glowing, battery indicator showing 70% charge. The last image in the buffer was a photograph of something standing at the edge of the creek. Thomas leaned closer to see the screen. The figure in the image was human-shaped but wrong in ways that made his eyes water to look at directly. It stood upright, but the proportions were off. Arms too long, joints bending in additional places. The head cocked at an angle that suggested the neck had too many vertebrae. The face was a blur, as if it had moved during the exposure, but Thomas could make out what might have been eyes reflecting the flash, too many of them, arranged in a pattern that wasn't bilateral. Behind the figure, barely visible in the darkness beyond the flash's reach, were others. Dozens of them. All standing motionless, all wrong in the same fundamental ways. The timestamp on the image. 02:47:03, October 18th, 2014. 2 days ago. Thomas's mouth had gone dry despite the water he'd been drinking. He clicked through the previous images on the camera's memory card. Sophia had been photographing elk at sunset, then bighorn sheep at dawn, then nothing for several hours, then the image of the figures, then dozens more images, all taken in rapid succession, all showing the same impossible scene from slightly different angles as she'd apparently backed away, still shooting, her photographer's instinct overriding her survival instinct. The final image showed a close-up. Too close. Whatever had been in front of the lens had been inches from it. The details were crystal clear despite how much Thomas's rational mind wanted to reject them. Skin that looked like tanned leather but moved like liquid, eyes that were simultaneously human and utterly alien, teeth that were too white, too perfect, too numerous. And in the background, barely in focus, Sophia herself. Not behind the camera. In front of it, her face frozen in an expression that Thomas had never seen on a human face before. Not fear, not exactly, but a kind of comprehension so terrible that it had broken something fundamental in her. If she was in the photo, who was holding the camera? Thomas jerked back from the screen, his flashlight beam swinging wildly around the shed. Empty. He was alone, but the shed's interior walls were covered in the same symbols he'd seen in the logbook, drawn in what looked like ash, or charcoal, or something darker. They covered every surface, overlapping, some freshly made and others older, faded. His radio crackled again. This time a voice came through clearly. "Tommy, Tommy, can you hear me?" His sister's voice. His sister who had died in a car accident 7 years ago. His sister whose name he never spoke, whose death had been the reason he'd transferred from suburban Sacramento to the most remote posting he could find, to a place where human contact was minimal and grief could be processed in solitude. "Tommy, I'm so cold. Why is it so cold?" He yanked the radio from his belt and turned it off. His hands were shaking. Dehydration, altitude, the heat. Any rational explanation except the one that was pressing against his consciousness like a wave against a failing dam. The symbols on the walls began to move, not physically moving. He could rationalize that away as optical illusion, as fatigue-induced hallucination. But they were definitely changing, the lines flowing into new configurations, the patterns evolving before his eyes in a way that made his stomach lurch, and as they changed, they started to form images he recognized. His sister's face, his childhood home, memories he'd tried to bury. Thomas backed out of the shed, his breathing rapid and shallow. The October sun felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He needed to get to higher ground, needed to call for backup, needed to... A sound from the creek, splashing, something large moving through water. He turned toward it, every instinct screaming at him to run back up the trail, to climb out of this canyon, to get away from whatever was happening here. But Sophia Carr was still missing. That was his job. Find the missing hiker. Everything else, the symbols, the photos, the voice on the radio, could be explained later, could be rationalized, could be fit into a framework that didn't require him to abandon everything he'd believed about the nature of reality. The creek ran clear and fast over rounded stones, snowmelt from the north rim feeding it even this late in the season. Something stood in the middle of it, knee-deep in the current. From a distance, it looked like Sophia. Same height, same build, same purple jacket. Intact now, not torn. "Sophia Carr?" Thomas called out. "I'm with the National Park Service. We've been trying to reach you." The figure turned. It wore Sophia's face, but the movement was wrong, too fluid. The head rotating further than human neck anatomy allowed. When it smiled, Thomas counted the teeth. Too many. All perfectly white, all identical, arranged in rows that receded back into a throat that seemed to have no end. "Thomas O'Brien," it said in Sophia's voice, in his sister's voice, in his own voice layered over itself. We've been waiting for you." The we revealed itself as other figures emerged from behind the rocks, from the trees, from places that shouldn't have been able to conceal anything. They all wore human forms like badly fitted suits, the proportions almost right but subtly wrong in ways that accumulated into profound wrongness. Some of them wore faces Thomas recognized, other missing hikers from over the years, people whose cases had been closed as accidental death or presumed animal attack. One wore his sister's face. Thomas's bear spray felt ridiculous in his hand. His training hadn't covered this. 11 years of NPS protocols, emergency response certification, wilderness first aid. None of it had prepared him for the moment when the rational world revealed itself to be a thin veneer over something infinitely stranger and more terrible. "What did you do to Sophia Carr?" His voice came out steady. He was proud of that. The figure wearing her face tilted its head. Sophia Carr did something to herself. She saw us. Really saw us, not the shapes we wear. She looked too long. Now she's one of us, walking in a skin that fits better than her old one ever did. That's not possible. You've been saying that for hours, Thomas, in your head. Not possible. Not real. Rational explanation. But you felt it, didn't you? When you found the jacket. When you saw the footprints. When you heard her voice on the radio. It took a step closer, water sloshing around its legs in a rhythm that didn't match its movement. You felt the world crack open and show you what's underneath. More figures were emerging now, dozens of them all wearing human forms with varying degrees of success. Some were nearly perfect mimics. Others had clearly given up trying, their bodies shifting and flowing, limbs multiplying and reconfiguring, faces becoming smooth and featureless, before suddenly exploding into arrangements of features that had nothing to do with human biology. Thomas's rational mind, the one that had sustained him through 11 years of telling himself there were no monsters, that every mystery had a mundane solution, was shattering. He could feel it breaking apart like ice under pressure, the cracks spreading through every certainty he'd built his life upon. "The Navajo call us Yinaldlushi," the Sophia thing said. "Skinwalkers. But we're older than that name. Older than the people who named us. We've been here since before your ancestors crawled out of caves. We wear skins because it amuses us. We wear faces because it frightens you. We walk in your shape because you taste better when you're confused about what you are. I don't believe in you." Thomas said it like a prayer, like a ward against evil, like the last desperate assertion of a worldview collapsing in real time. The thing laughed, and the sound came from all the figures simultaneously, a chorus of voices in perfect unison. "Belief is irrelevant. You're standing here. We're standing here. The question isn't whether we're real. The question is what happens to Thomas O'Brien now that he knows we're real." They began to move toward him, not hurrying, taking their time. Why rush? There was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose sheer on both sides. The trail back up would take hours. And he was beginning to understand that distance didn't matter to things that could wear any shape. That could be the hiker you passed on the trail, the ranger at the next station, the voice on your radio. His sister's face smiled at him from one of the approaching figures. "You should have stayed in Sacramento, Tommy. You should have stayed where it was safe. But you came here, to the old places, the deep places, the places where we've always been. Now you're ours." Thomas ran. He dropped the bear spray, dropped everything that weighed him down, and sprinted back toward the trail. Behind him, he heard laughter. Not following, just amused, the way an adult might laugh at a child who thinks they can hide by covering their eyes. The trail stretched up before him, the switchbacks brutal, each one adding elevation in a gradual climb that would normally take 3 hours. Thomas pushed himself harder than he'd ever pushed before, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape his body before the rest of him was caught. He didn't look back. Looking back would mean seeing them following, would mean confirming they were real, would mean accepting that everything he'd built his identity around, rationality, skepticism, the supremacy of scientific explanation, was a comfortable lie humanity told itself to sleep at night. At the first switchback, he risked a glance down. The figures stood at the bottom of the trail, watching. They weren't following. They didn't need to. They had time. The canyon wasn't going anywhere. Neither was he, really. Where would he run that they couldn't follow? Back to the rim? Into town? They wore human faces. They could be anyone. His radio, which he'd thought he'd turned off, crackled to life again. Thomas. His own voice speaking to him from his own hip. Thomas, stop running. You're only making it worse. He yanked the radio free and threw it over the cliff edge. It tumbled through space, bouncing off rock walls, finally splashing into the creek hundreds of feet below. The voice continued from behind him. We're already inside your head, Thomas. We've been there since you found the jacket. Since you saw the symbols. Since you tried to convince yourself this wasn't happening. Every time you said, not possible, you made room for us. Every rationalization was an invitation. He spun around. Nothing. Empty trail. Just red rock and scrub vegetation. And the vast, indifferent sky. We're going to take our time with you. His voice continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You're special, Thomas. 11 years of denying us. 11 years of explaining away every warning, every sign, every story. You've built up such a thick wall of skepticism. It's going to be so satisfying to tear it down piece by piece. Thomas resumed climbing. His legs were lead weights. His chest felt like it was being crushed. At 43, his body wasn't designed for this kind of exertion in this kind of heat. But stopping meant accepting. And accepting meant they'd won. At the next switchback, he found his radio lying in the middle of the trail. The same radio he'd thrown over the cliff 200 feet below. He stepped over it and kept climbing. The sun was setting now, shadows stretching across the canyon in long fingers of darkness. Thomas had been climbing for hours. His water was gone. His legs were cramping. But he could see the rim above. Maybe another 45 minutes of hiking. Once he reached it, he could get to his truck, drive to the ranger station, report. What? What would he report? That Sophia Carr had been transformed into something wearing her skin? That the canyon was full of creatures that looked human but weren't? That every missing persons case in the park's history might not have been accidents after all? They'd put him on administrative leave, require a psychological evaluation. He'd lose his job, his career, everything he'd built since his sister's death. Unless he said nothing. Unless he reported that he'd found Sophia Carr's jacket, signs of an animal attack, presumed fatality. Unless he maintained the comfortable lie. He reached the rim as the last light was dying. His truck sat in the parking lot where he'd left it 7 hours ago. Empty. No other vehicles. The October tourist season was truly dead now. Thomas fumbled his keys from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. He climbed in, started the engine, turned the heat on despite the warm evening air. He needed to feel normal, to engage in normal routines, to rebuild the walls that had been shattered. The radio in his truck, the vehicle's built-in radio, not his service radio, turned on by itself. His sister's voice came through the speakers. You can't leave, Tommy. You know what we are now. You've seen behind the mask. If you leave, you'll tell people, you'll warn them. We can't have that. I won't tell anyone, Thomas said to the empty truck. I'll say it was an animal attack. I'll say there was no sign of Sophia. I'll maintain the story, just let me go. But Thomas, his voice said from the back seat. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw himself sitting there, wearing his own face, smiling with too many teeth. Why would we let you go when you're already ours? The thing in the back seat leaned forward. Thomas could smell it now, the scent of old leather and copper, and something underneath that had never been human. Its hand, his hand, reached around and gently touched his shoulder. You're going to drive back to the station, it said. You're going to file a report. You're going to tell them you found evidence of a mountain lion attack. You're going to recommend the case be closed. And then you're going to continue being Thomas O'Brien, park ranger, skeptic, man who doesn't believe in monsters. And if I don't, then we start visiting your coworkers, your friends, that niece in Phoenix you're so careful about calling every Sunday. We'll wear your face when we do it. We'll make sure you watch. Thomas stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The thing behind him smiled wider, its mouth splitting further than his jaw should allow, revealing row after row of perfect white teeth. Or, it continued, you could accept what you've become. Stop fighting it. Let go of Thomas O'Brien and all his careful rationality. Become something new, something that doesn't have to pretend anymore. I'm not one of you, Thomas whispered. Not yet, but you saw us, really saw us, and you survived the seeing. That changes a person. Already you can feel it, can't you? The world looks different now, smells different. The shapes people wear seem less solid. You're starting to see the seams. Thomas looked at his hands on the steering wheel. In the dim light of the truck's interior, they looked normal. But when he squinted, when he let his focus soften, he could see something underneath the skin, something that writhed and shifted, something that had always been there but that he'd never allowed himself to perceive. No, he said firmly. I'm human. I'm Thomas O'Brien. I don't believe in you. Keep telling yourself that, the thing said, and then it wasn't in the back seat anymore. Thomas was alone in the truck, alone except for the smell of old leather and copper that lingered in the air. He drove back to the ranger station, filed the report, mountain lion attack. No sign of Sophia Carr beyond scattered clothing and equipment. Presumed fatality, recovery unlikely. Case closed. His supervisor accepted the report without question. Why wouldn't he? Thomas O'Brien was reliable, rational. 11 years without a single questionable incident. Thomas went home to his small house on the edge of the park. He showered, scrubbing his skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the smell that nobody else seemed to notice. He made dinner, chicken breast and rice, the same meal he made 3 times a week. He watched television, a documentary about climate change, comfortingly full of data and charts and rational analysis. At midnight, he looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. His reflection looked back, but when he turned away, the reflection stayed still for just a moment too long, smiling with just a few too many teeth. Thomas O'Brien, skeptic, rationalist, man of science, turned off the light and went to bed. He didn't look in mirrors anymore if he could help it. He didn't hike alone in the backcountry. He didn't answer his radio when it crackled to life with voices he recognized. And on clear nights, when he looked out his window at the vast darkness of the Grand Canyon, he sometimes saw figures standing at the rim, watching his house. They wore human shapes, but he could see the seams now. He would always see the seams. Sometimes he wondered if he'd really made it out of the canyon that day. Sometimes he wondered if Thomas O'Brien had died down there at Phantom Ranch and something else had walked back up wearing his face. Sometimes he looked at his hands and wasn't sure anymore, but he never told anyone. He maintained the lie, because the alternative, admitting what he'd seen, admitting what he'd become, meant accepting that everything he'd built his identity around was false. And Thomas O'Brien, or whatever wore his name now, wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The Park Service transferred him 3 months later. Not disciplinary, just routine rotation. They sent him to Olympic National Park in Washington, another remote posting, another place where the old stories still whispered in the dark. He accepted without question. What else could he do? He was a park ranger. He protected people from the dangers of the wilderness. Even if the greatest danger was the wilderness inside them, the thing they'd always been but had never allowed themselves to see. On his last night in Arizona, Thomas stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon one final time. The figures were there, watching. They didn't approach. They didn't need to. He carried them with him now, in the way he moved, in the way he saw the world, in the spaces between his thoughts where something that wasn't quite Thomas O'Brien lived and waited. One of them raised a hand in farewell. It wore Sophia Carr's face. Thomas raised his hand in return. The gesture felt natural now. Comfortable, he drove away as the sun rose, heading north toward his new posting, his new life, his new skin. In the rearview mirror, his reflection smiled, and for just a moment, before he caught himself and forced his face back into its customary expression, he saw all the teeth. Behind him, the Grand Canyon stretched vast and indifferent, keeping its secrets the way it had kept secrets for millions of years. The canyon didn't care what walked its trails wearing human faces. The canyon had seen stranger things, older things, things that made skinwalkers look like children playing dress-up. The canyon remembered when there had been no humans at all, and it would remember long after they were gone. And somewhere down in the depths, in the shadows where the sun never quite reached, something that had once been Sophia Carr smiled with too many teeth and waited for the next skeptic, the next rationalist, the next person who was so certain that monsters weren't real. The canyon was patient. It had time. It always had time. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Thomas. The voicemail lasted 47 seconds. William Archer played it 6 times before accepting that the wet, tearing sounds between Connor Burke's screams weren't wind or static, and that the voice answering him in Romanian belonged to someone who'd been dead for 3 weeks. William sat in his truck outside the Olympic National Park ranger station, phone pressed against his ear, rain drumming on the roof with the persistence of a migraine. The timestamp on the message read 11:47 p.m., December 18th. Connor had been reported missing on the 19th. The math didn't work, but then again, nothing about this situation had worked from the beginning. He'd known Connor Burke peripherally, the kind of acquaintance forged through repeated encounters on popular trails. The young photographer had been documenting the Hoh Rainforest's temperate ecosystem for his master's thesis at University of Washington. Professional, cautious, the type who filed trip plans and carried redundant navigation equipment. Not the type to vanish without explanation. William pressed play again. Connor's voice, ragged with terror. Jesus Christ, it's following me. I can hear it in the trees. It knows my name. How does it know my... A sound like fabric tearing, or meat separating from bone. Then Connor again, smaller. Please, I don't understand what you want. And finally, that other voice, thick with an accent William's linguistic training barely recognized. Înțelegi acum? Familia plătește pentru păcatele lor. You understand now? The family pays for their sins. William had a biology degree from Oregon State, 8 years with the National Park Service, and a methodical mind that insisted on rational explanations. Animals made sounds that resembled human speech. Audio compression created artifacts. Fear and hypothermia caused hallucinations. But the voice on that recording spoke with grammatical precision, and the Romanian was flawless. He'd spent 3 hours that morning researching. The words matched no wildlife vocalization database. The dialect was archaic, possibly 19th century, according to a linguistics professor at Western Washington University he'd emailed. The background sounds, branches breaking with metronomic regularity, something heavy dragging through undergrowth, suggested purposeful movement, not random environmental noise. The rational part of William's mind cataloged these facts, while another part, one he'd spent his adult life suppressing, recognized the quality of Connor's terror. The young man hadn't been afraid of dying. He'd been afraid of what came after. William started the truck. Connor's last known GPS coordinates placed him 4 miles up the Devil's Creek Trail, deep in the Hoh Rainforest where even winter hikers rarely ventured. The trail gained 1,800 feet over broken terrain, threading through Sitka spruce and western hemlock, thick enough to obscure the sun even at noon. In December, with the rain and fog, visibility would be measured in yards. He drove east on Highway 101, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The Olympic Peninsula in winter was a study in gray. Gray sky bleeding into gray forest, bleeding into gray pavement. The tourists were gone. The towns reduced to skeleton crews of locals who understood that this was the rainforest's true season, when it reclaimed its ancient character and forgot about human concerns. The Devil's Creek Trailhead parking lot was empty, except for a white Subaru Outback with University of Washington parking permits in the window. Connor's car. It had been sitting here for 4 days, Moss was already establishing itself on the windshield. William suited up, Motorola radio clipped to his belt, Garmin GPS in his chest pocket, first aid kit, emergency bivouac supplies, his personal Glock 19 in a hip holster. The sidearm was technically outside protocol, but William had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was profoundly wrong with this situation. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path cutting through old growth. William logged the waypoints automatically, Sitka spruce with DBH measurements exceeding 8 feet, nurse logs supporting entire ecosystems, sword ferns creating emerald understory thick as carpet. This was his domain, the empirical world of taxonomy and ecological succession. Here, everything had explanations. But half a mile in, he noticed the first anomaly. A Roosevelt elk carcass, partially concealed beneath a windfall cedar. The animal had been dead perhaps 3 days, judging by decomposition, but something about it stopped William cold. The body was intact, no predation, no scavenging. In a rainforest teeming with opportunistic feeders, that was impossible. Black bears, raccoons, even Douglas squirrels should have reduced the carcass to bones and scraps. William knelt, pulling on nitrile gloves. The elk's eyes were open, filmed with the opacity of death, but the expression captured there made his stomach contract. Terror. Prey animals died in fear regularly, but this was different. This was the face of something that had seen its own impossibility. The puncture wounds on the neck were clean, precise, nothing like cougar kills William had documented. They penetrated deep, angled toward major vessels with almost surgical knowledge. And the blood? There wasn't enough of it. An elk this size should have painted the surrounding vegetation red. Instead, the forest floor was barely stained. William photographed the carcass from 6 angles, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued up the trail. His rational mind offered explanations: disease, poison, some pathology that made scavengers avoid the corpse. But that voice on Connor's voicemail echoed in his memory. Familia plătește pentru păcatele lor. The family pays for their sins. At mile 2, the trail crossed Devil's Creek via a wooden footbridge. The water ran high and dark, swollen with winter rain. William stopped. Something was wrong with the sound. Rivers in the Olympics had a particular acoustic signature: the rush of water over stone, the percussion of debris, the subtle harmonics of current and depth. This sounded muffled, dampened, as if the water itself was reluctant to make noise. He looked downstream and saw them. Crosses, dozens of them. Crude wooden crosses planted along both banks of the creek, extending into the forest shadows until they disappeared. They were old, gray with weather, leaning at drunken angles. Some had inscriptions, but the wood had degraded too much to read. William's GPS showed nothing. No markers, no historical sites, no notation of any kind. He pulled out his phone, no signal, expected at this elevation, and photographed the crosses. The camera struggled with the low light, rendering the forest beyond as pure black interrupted by those pale wooden verticals. A sound made him turn. Something moved in the trees upslope, branches shaking with rhythmic purpose, too methodical for wind, too heavy for any animal that should be active in December. William's hand found the Glock's grip without conscious thought. "National Park Service," he called out. "Identify yourself." The movement stopped. Silence rushed back, but it was wrong somehow, too complete. The ambient sound of the rainforest, dripping water, settling branches, distant bird calls, had vanished. William stood in absolute quiet, rain pattering on his hood, the only proof that time hadn't stopped. Then from upslope a voice, male, accented, speaking with the cadence of someone reading from a text. William Archer, 41 years, biology degree, Oregon State University, 2006. 8 years National Park Service. No family, no wife, no children to mourn you. Ice crystallized in William's chest. The voice knew him. More than that, it had researched him, studied him. That wasn't animal behavior. That wasn't anything his rational mind could categorize. "Who are you?" William kept his voice level, Ranger calm. I'm here looking for Connor Burke. If you have information about his location, I need you to... Connor Burke in Selejicum. The voice was closer now, though William had seen nothing move. He understands what his family did, what they took. The debt must be paid in blood, always blood. William's hand was on his pistol now. Step into view, slowly. Keep your hands visible. Laughter rolled down through the trees, and it was the worst sound William had ever heard. Not cruel or mocking, but genuinely amused the way someone laughs at a child's misunderstanding. Your weapon is useless, biologistal. You cannot kill what has already died. You cannot reason with what exists beyond reason. A figure stepped from behind a massive Sitka spruce 50 yards upslope. At that distance, through rain and failing light, William could make out only a silhouette, human-shaped but wrong somehow, proportions subtly off. It stood completely still, and William realized with creeping horror that the rain wasn't touching it. The precipitation fell around the figure, creating a dry column of air that defied meteorological possibility. William's radio crackled. Impossible. He was too deep in the forest for signal, surrounded by topography that blocked transmission. But static burst through, then a voice, Connor's voice. William? William, can you hear me? Connor sounded terrified but alert, nothing like the screaming man from the voicemail. I'm at the old cemetery. Grid reference 478623, 123.9847. Please hurry. Christ, it's going to be dark soon. William fumbled for his GPS. The coordinates were 3 miles further up the trail, in an area his park map showed as unbroken forest. No cemetery, no historical designation. But Connor's voice was unmistakable. Connor, what's your condition? Are you injured? I don't know anymore. I can't remember coming here. But William, you need to see this. The graves, they're empty. All of them are empty. The transmission cut out. William looked upslope. The figure was gone, but the rain still fell wrong in that spot, creating negative space against the forest. Every protocol William knew screamed at him to call for backup, to retreat to the trailhead, to approach this situation with appropriate caution and support. But Connor was alive, or at least something that sounded exactly like Connor was transmitting from deeper in the forest. And if there was any chance the young photographer could be extracted safely, William had a professional and moral obligation to try. He climbed. The trail deteriorated rapidly above the bridge. What had been maintained path became a muddy scramble over exposed roots and moss-slicked stones. William's legs burned with the grade, his breath coming hard in the cold air. The forest pressed close, hemlock and spruce creating a ceiling so dense that twilight arrived early here, even by December standards. He found Connor's equipment at mile 3, a professional-grade Canon camera system, still in its weatherproof case, sitting upright on a flat boulder as if carefully placed. The case was clean. No mud, no debris, no evidence it had been out in the rain for 4 days. William opened it. The camera inside was functional, memory card intact. He reviewed the last photos. Connor had been documenting fungal growth on nurse logs, detailed macro shots of pale mushrooms William recognized as Armillaria ostoyae. Then the sequence jumped. The next image showed darkness, just pure black with a timestamp of 11:43 p.m., December 18th. Then another 4 minutes later, showing what appeared to be an interior space, wooden walls, ancient joists, earthen floor. Then Connor's final photo, a figure standing in shadow, face obscured, but the posture suggested someone waiting with infinite patience. William's hand shook as he pocketed the memory card. That last photo had been taken at 11:47 p.m., the exact moment Connor's voicemail began. The GPS coordinates from Connor's transmission were close now, maybe half a mile. William climbed faster, rain and sweat mixing under his jacket. The forest was changing. The trees were wrong, not in species but in arrangement. They grew in lines, geometric patterns that old-growth forest never naturally formed. Someone had planted these trees, or something had organized them according to principles William didn't understand. He crested a small ridge and saw it. A clearing, maybe an acre across, filled with grave markers. Not the wooden crosses from the creek. These were stone, proper headstones worn smooth by decades of rain. And Connor had been right. The graves were open. Every single one had been excavated, dirt piled neatly beside rectangular holes that descended into darkness. William approached slowly, pistol drawn. The headstones bore Romanian names: Popescu, Ionescu, Dumitrescu. The dates were clustered around the 1890s. Most graves held multiple bodies, entire families judging by the inscriptions. William's historical knowledge was limited, but he knew the Olympic Peninsula had seen waves of European immigration during the timber boom. Romanians had worked the lumber camps, dangerous work that killed men with casual frequency. "Connor?" William's voice sounded small in the clearing. "Connor Burke, if you can hear me, respond." Movement at the far edge of the cemetery. William spun, bringing the Glock up. Connor Burke stepped from between two graves, and William's relief lasted exactly 1 second before his rational mind caught up with what he was seeing. Connor looked perfect, unharmed, clean, his expensive outdoor gear unmarked by 4 days in the wilderness. His face showed no signs of exposure, no hypothermia, no trauma. He looked like someone who'd just started their hike, not someone who'd been missing for nearly a week. "William," Connor's voice was flat, affectless. "You shouldn't have come here." "Connor, thank God, your family's been... What happened to you? Are you injured?" Connor tilted his head, studying William with an expression that was clinically detached. "I tried to photograph them, the markers down by the creek. I thought it was historical interest, forgotten pioneer graves. But they weren't forgotten. The descendants remembered. They remembered, and they're angry." "Who's angry?" "Connor, you're not making sense. We need to..." "The Popescu family." Connor gestured to the nearest headstone. "They came from Wallachia in 1889. 23 people, men, women, children. They worked the timber camps. They saved money, bought land, built homes. And then the fever came. Typhoid. It killed 16 of them in 3 weeks." William kept his pistol trained on Connor, but felt increasingly foolish doing so. "I don't understand what this has to do with your disappearance." "The survivors blamed my family." Connor's voice remained eerily calm. "The Burkes owned the lumber company. They knew the water was contaminated, but they didn't shut down operations. 16 people died because my great-great-grandfather valued profit over lives. And in their culture, William, in the old country beliefs they brought with them, that kind of injustice demands payment. Connor, you need medical attention. You're hypothermic, maybe suffering from exposure-induced psychosis. Let me..." They came back. Connor stepped closer, and William saw it now, the wrongness. Connor's chest wasn't moving. No breath misted in the cold air. The dead Popescus. They came back as Strigoi, the undead who cannot rest until justice is served. They've been here for over a century, William, waiting in these graves, sustained by their rage. And I woke them up. I disturbed their cemetery. I took photographs. I violated their rest. William's finger tensed on the trigger. "Stop. Don't come any closer." Connor smiled, and it was a terrible thing to witness. "You still don't understand. You're still trying to fit this into your rational framework. Let me show you." Connor reached up and pulled aside the collar of his jacket. The wound on his neck was massive, ragged, nothing like the clean punctures William had seen on the elk. Something had torn Connor's throat open, had drunk deeply, and physics said a man with that injury should be bleeding out, dying, dead. But Connor wasn't bleeding. The wound was dry, edges gray as old meat, and when he opened his mouth wider than human anatomy should allow, William saw the teeth. Not fangs, nothing cinematic, just human incisors lengthened slightly, filed or worn to points. "They drained me first," Connor explained conversationally. 3 of them held me down while the matriarch fed. Then they buried me, not deep, just enough to cover the body, and I lay there in the earth for 3 days feeling myself change, feeling my heart slow and stop and then start again, beating differently, beating with hunger. William fired. The Glock's report echoed across the cemetery, shockingly loud. The 9mm round hit Connor center mass exactly where William had trained, where the heart and major vessels concentrated, where a shot meant incapacitation or death. Connor looked down at the hole in his jacket, then back up at William. "I told you, already dead. Can't kill what's already died." William fired again, and again, each shot precise, each impact visible, Connor's body jerking with ballistic force. But there was no blood, no collapse. Connor just stood there, head tilted, waiting for William to understand. The Glock slide locked back, empty. 15 rounds gone, and Connor Burke stood unmarked by anything except holes in his clothing. William's hands were shaking now, his rational mind fragmenting against impossible reality. "The biologist still doesn't believe his eyes." The accented voice from earlier spoke from behind William. He spun. An old woman stood at the cemetery's edge, bent with age but steady. She wore clothing from another era, heavy dark wool, hand-stitched, the kind of garments immigrants had treasured as links to home. Her face was weathered, lined with decades of hard living and harder dying. "You study life, yes? Classification, taxonomy, ecology. But you never study death. You never ask what happens when the dead refuse their grave." More figures emerged from the forest. Men, women, even children, all dressed in 19th century clothing, all moving with that same wrong stillness. Their skin held the gray pallor of corpses, but their eyes were alert, intelligent, burning with purpose that transcended mortality. "I am Elena Popescu." The old woman moved closer. William fumbled for his radio, but his fingers wouldn't obey, shock overriding motor control. "I lost my husband, 3 sons, 2 daughters, 6 grandchildren to poisoned water. I lay dying, listening to my family scream in the fever, and I swore an oath. I swore we would have justice, even if I had to claw my way back from death to claim it." William finally found his voice. "The Burkes are dead. Connor's family sold the lumber company in the 1920s. Whatever injustice was done, the guilty are long gone." Elena smiled, revealing those same modified teeth. "The debt passes through blood. The Strigoi do not forget. We waited in our graves, sustained by rage and the old magic, waiting for a Burke to come to our mountain. And finally, after so many years, one did. A young man with a camera, documenting the beautiful rainforest that grows on our suffering." Connor spoke from behind William. "They gave me a choice. Die permanently, truly dead, soul extinguished. Or accept the change, become what they are, and help them find the rest of my family. Help them balance the debt. And you chose?" William already knew the answer. "I chose to live, even like this. Even hungry and cold and wrong, I chose to continue existing. Can you blame me?" William couldn't speak. His worldview, carefully constructed over 41 years, was collapsing. The rational universe he'd believed in, where biology and physics and chemistry explained everything, had proven false. The dead walked. The supernatural existed. And he was trapped in a cemetery with creatures that defied every law of nature he'd ever learned. Elena approached until she stood directly in front of William. Her breath didn't mist in the cold because she wasn't breathing. "You are not Burke. You carry no debt. But you have seen us. You have witnessed what should remain hidden. What will you do, biologistal? Return to your ranger station and file a report? Tell them that the dead walk in the Ho rainforest?" William's mind raced. Every professional instinct screamed at him to document, to report, to expose this impossible situation to scientific scrutiny. But another part of him, the part that had evolved through millions of years to recognize predators, understood that he was hopelessly outmatched. These weren't animals following instinct. These were human minds with human intelligence, sharpened by decades of undeath and focused with singular purpose. "Let me go." William hated how small his voice sounded. "I won't tell anyone. I'll report that Connor was killed by exposure, that I found his body too degraded to recover. I'll falsify the evidence. Just let me leave." Elena studied him with eyes that held more than a century of patience. You would lie? You would violate your principles, abandon your rational mind, commit professional fraud, all to preserve your life? Yes. No hesitation. William had spent his adult life believing in truth and evidence, but when faced with extinction, principles were meaningless. I'll do whatever you want, just don't make me like him. Like me, Connor corrected, and something in his tone suggested the young man he'd been was still present, still suffering inside his transformed body. Say it right. Don't make you like me. Elena nodded slowly. You will leave. You will file your false report. You will never speak of what you saw. And if you break this oath, William Archer, we will know. The Strigoi have long memories and longer reach. Do you understand? I understand. No. Elena's hand shot out, gripping William's chin with strength that should have been impossible from someone so small and old. You don't understand yet, but you will. Go home. Resume your life. Study your biology and your taxonomy. But every night when you lie in darkness, you will remember this. You will remember that death is not the end. You will remember that justice outlasts mortality. You will remember that the universe is not rational, not safe, not bound by the laws you thought were absolute. And that knowledge, biologistal, will hollow you out from within. She released him. William stumbled backward, his legs barely supporting his weight. The Strigoi stood motionless, watching, waiting to see what he would choose. Behind them, the empty graves yawned like mouths, and William understood with cold certainty that if he tried to run, if he violated his promise, those graves would be his eternity. Go, Elena said, before we change our minds. William went. He stumbled down the trail, night falling fast, his headlamp beam barely penetrating the darkness. His radio remained silent. His GPS showed the trail, the creek, the parking lot, all the normal waypoints of a normal forest. But William knew now that normalcy was an illusion, a comfortable lie people told themselves to sleep at night. He reached his truck at midnight. The Subaru was still there, moss-covered, abandoned. William sat in his cab with the engine running, heater blasting, trying to stop shaking. His phone showed dozens of missed calls, messages from the station asking for updates. He ignored them all and opened his laptop. The report took 3 hours to write. Exposure, hypothermia, animal predation making the body unrecoverable. The sanitized language of tragedy that reduced Connor Burke to a statistic. William attached falsified photos, GPS coordinates that led nowhere, evidence of a search that had found nothing. He submitted the report at 3:47 a.m. and sat in the parking lot as dawn broke gray and cold over the Olympic Mountains. In 8 years as a ranger, William had believed he understood this forest. He'd known its ecology, its geology, its behavior. But that understanding had been a child's comprehension, simplified and incomplete. The forest held darker knowledge. The forest remembered sins and demanded payment. The forest nurtured things that should not exist, and William Archer would carry that truth for the rest of his life. He drove back to the ranger station and filed the paperwork. Colleagues asked questions. He answered with professional detachment, citing protocol and evidence. No one doubted him. Why would they? William Archer was methodical, rational, reliable. But that night, lying in bed with lights on because darkness had become unbearable, William felt the hollowing Elena had promised. The certainty that had defined his existence was gone, replaced by knowledge he could never unlearn. He thought of Connor Burke, walking the forest eternally hungry, serving the debt his ancestors had incurred. He thought of Elena Popescu and her family, sustained by rage for over a century, their graves empty but their purpose undying. He thought of the elk carcass drained of blood, the crosses marking territory claimed by the dead, and he knew, with sick certainty, that he would never sleep soundly again. The voicemail remained on his phone. William had tried to delete it a dozen times but couldn't force himself to press the button. Some part of him needed the evidence, needed proof that what he'd experienced was real. Late at night, When insomnia held him hostage, he would play it back. Connor's screams, the wet, tearing sounds, that voice speaking Romanian. Familia plătește pentru păcatele lor. The family pays for their sins. William had thought himself a scientist, an empiricist, someone who understood reality through observation and data. But Elena had been right. He didn't understand. He only knew now that the universe was far stranger and more terrible than his rational mind had ever allowed. Connor Burke was officially declared dead on January 15th, 3 weeks after he vanished. The memorial service drew 200 people, family, friends, colleagues from the university. William attended out of obligation and sat in the back row, watching Connor's parents weep for a son who wasn't actually dead, just transformed into something that wore death like clothing. At the service's end, Connor's mother approached William. She was small, gray-haired, crushed by grief. "Thank you," she said, taking William's hand. "Thank you for trying to find him. I know you did everything possible." William wanted to tell her the truth. Wanted to explain that her son still walked, still existed, still thought and felt and suffered in ways that made death seem merciful. But Elena's warning echoed. "We will know. We have long reach." "I'm sorry I couldn't bring him home," William said, and the words tasted like ash. Mrs. Burke squeezed his hand and left. William stood in the empty church, surrounded by flowers and remembrance, and felt the final pieces of his old self crumble away. He continued working, filed reports, maintained trails, responded to emergencies. On the surface, nothing had changed, but internally William Archer had become a different person, someone who jumped at shadows, who avoided the Hoh rainforest, who understood that professional competence and rational thinking were fragile constructs, barely concealing humanity's fundamental vulnerability. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. The rainforest bloomed with its usual extravagance, tourists returned, and life resumed its normal rhythms. William went through the motions, performing his duties with mechanical precision. But then, in late March, another hiker was reported missing. Different trail, different circumstances, but something about the report made William's blood freeze. The missing person was David Burke, Connor's younger brother, last seen hiking the Quinault River Trail. William's hands shook as he read the report. This wasn't coincidence. Elena had promised Connor would help find the rest of his family. The debt wasn't paid. The Strigoi weren't satisfied. He should have reported his suspicions, should have warned the search teams about what they might encounter. But Elena's threat remained vivid in his memory, and William's capacity for self-preservation outweighed his professional ethics. The search lasted 5 days. David Burke was never found. William participated in the effort, hiking trails he'd walked hundreds of times, and saw nothing unusual. But one evening, returning to the trailhead after dark, he spotted a figure standing at the forest's edge. Connor Burke, or what Connor had become. The young man's face was gaunt, eyes holding that terrible predatory awareness. But he raised one hand in what might have been greeting or warning. William stopped. They regarded each other across 50 yards of darkness. "How many?" William finally asked. "How many more?" Connor's voice drifted through the trees, barely audible. "Until the debt is balanced. Until justice is served. However long it takes." Then he was gone, melted into shadows as if he'd never existed. William drove home that night with the certainty that this was only the beginning. The Burkes had been a large family, prosperous and extensive. There would be more disappearances, more mysterious deaths, more instances of justice older than law claiming its due, and William would remain silent. Would file false reports, would misdirect investigations, would protect himself by protecting the terrible secret he carried. He'd become complicit in something beyond murder, beyond any crime the legal system recognized. Elena Popescu had promised the knowledge would hollow him out. She'd been right. William Archer, once dedicated to truth and empirical understanding, had become a collaborator in supernatural horror. He maintained the illusion of normalcy while knowing that beneath the forest's green surface, ancient debts were being collected by the undead. Some nights, William drove to the Hoh rainforest trailhead, and sat in his truck, staring into darkness. He thought about hiking up to that cemetery, about confronting Elena, about demanding release from the burden she'd placed on him. But he never did. Because deep in his hollowed-out soul, William understood that he'd made his choice that night in the cemetery. He'd chosen survival over principle, self-preservation over truth. And that choice had bound him as surely as any supernatural curse. The dead walked in the Olympic National Park. They pursued justice older than America, older than the trees, rooted in traditions that predated rational thought. And William Archer, biologist and empiricist, had become their unwilling guardian, keeping their secret while they slowly, methodically, erased a family's bloodline. He thought of Connor Burke's final photo, that figure waiting with infinite patience. And William realized with cold horror that he'd become something similar. A figure waiting, watching, knowing terrible truths while the world around him remained blissfully ignorant. The voicemail was still on his phone. He would never delete it. Some part of William needed the reminder, needed to remember that one December night when his rational universe collapsed and revealed the far stranger, darker reality beneath. Familia plătește pentru păcatele lor. The family pays for their sins. And William Archer paid too in different currency. His certainty, his integrity, his capacity for restful sleep. He paid with the knowledge that death was not the end, that justice transcended mortality, that the forest he'd devoted his career to understanding held secrets that defied all understanding. He would carry that payment for the rest of his life. And when his own death finally came, William wondered with terrible clarity whether it would bring relief or simply a different form of continuation, whether he too might find himself unable to rest, bound by choices made and knowledge gained, walking an eternal vigil in forests that remembered everything and forgave nothing. The thought kept him awake most nights. And in the darkness, listening to rain drum against his window, William Archer understood what Elena Popescu had really done. She hadn't just let him live. She'd cursed him with something worse than death. The burden of witnessing, the torture of knowing, the slow dissolution of everything he'd believed about reality and truth. The dead walked, and William, still breathing, still technically alive, had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by knowledge he could never share and secrets that would follow him to whatever waited beyond the grave. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The trail camera's timestamp read 02.4733. Frame 2.847 showed the Hoh River Trail exactly as Daniel Kowalski expected. Empty path, moss-draped Sitka spruces, ferns bending in wind he couldn't hear through the digital silence. Frame 2.848, captured 1/10 of a second later, showed a woman standing in the exact center of the frame. Frame 2.849 showed a wolf in the same position, same pixel coordinates, casting a shadow at the wrong angle for the moon's documented position that night. Frame 2.850 was empty again. Daniel had watched the sequence 47 times in the past 2 hours, seated at his desk in the Olympic National Park Ranger Station, while rain hammered the roof with the persistence of a migraine. Each viewing revealed new impossibilities. The woman's clothes didn't move between frames. The wolf's eyes reflected the camera's infrared flash as twin coins of light that no organic eye should produce. The ground showed no disturbance, no paw prints, no boot treads. Nothing. His Garmin GPS unit, synchronized with the trail camera's internal clock, confirmed what his spreadsheet already proved. Ashley Nguyen had disappeared somewhere along the Hoh River Trail between 02 Balars and 03 ORs on October 23, 2014. The trail camera, mounted at mile marker 4.3, had captured her passing southbound at 02:31:17. She never reached the trailhead. She never triggered the camera at mile marker 2.8. 16 minutes of trail simply swallowed her, except now Daniel had these 3 frames. He rubbed his eyes, felt the grit of 72 hours with maybe 6 hours of sleep scattered between shifts. The search and rescue operation had officially scaled back yesterday. Ashley's parents would arrive from Portland tomorrow morning, and he would need to tell them something that made sense. That their daughter, an experienced day hiker who'd grown up camping in these mountains, had somehow vanished on a trail she could have walked blindfolded. The station's fluorescent lights hummed, a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his teeth. Daniel clicked through his files. 4 other disappearances in Olympic National Park over the past 18 months. He'd never connected them before because the park spanned nearly 1 million acres. Statistically, people got lost. But now, with Ashley's case forcing him to review every detail, patterns emerged like faces in static. Marcus Chen, day hiker, vanished March 2013 near Solduke Falls. Last seen at 1422 by a family from Ohio. Never found. Timothy Morrison, experienced backpacker, disappeared June 2013 on the High Divide Trail. His tent was discovered still zipped shut from the inside, sleeping bag empty, boots placed neatly by the entrance. No footprints leading away. Jennifer Hayes, naturalist conducting a plant survey, lost September 2013 in the Quinault rainforest. Her field notes ended mid-sentence. Unusual animal calls seemed to be following. Robert Silva, trail maintenance worker, vanished February 2014. His chainsaw was found running, leaned against a fallen cedar. He'd been cutting the tree from both sides. The saw on the far side was still warm when they found it 30 minutes later. Robert was gone. And now, Ashley Nguyen. Daniel opened the file folder he'd been compiling against protocol, against common sense. He'd driven to each site over the past month, photographing, measuring, collecting data that meant nothing in any official report. But the data existed. 37 miles separated the northernmost disappearance from the southernmost. If he plotted them on his topographic map, they formed a rough arc through the most remote sections of old-growth forest, areas where western red cedars grew to 15 feet in diameter, and the canopy blocked so much light that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. At each site he'd found trees marked with symbols, not carved. The bark showed no cutting, no scarring. The marks appeared to be burned into the wood with precision that suggested tools, except Daniel had tested the char and found no accelerant residue, no chemical signature. Just carbon where carbon shouldn't be, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Spirals that seemed to rotate when viewed peripherally. Angular shapes that suggested pictographic language, but matched nothing in his reference databases on regional Native American iconography. He'd photographed the symbols with his Nikon D3200, careful to include scale references and GPS coordinates. The camera had worked fine at 4 of the 5 sites. At the location where Jennifer Hayes vanished, every photo came out corrupted, vertical bands of discolored pixels that his computer couldn't process, error messages in garbled text that might have been Unicode characters from languages his system didn't recognize. Daniel clicked back to the trail camera footage. Enhanced the image, increased the contrast. The woman in frame 2848 wore a green jacket. Ashley Nguyen had been wearing a green jacket when she'd signed in at the ranger station that morning, joking about the rain, promising to be back before dark. The jacket in the image showed no detail, no texture. It existed as pure color, flat as paint. The wolf in frame 2849 was worse. Its proportions were wrong. Legs too long, head too narrow, rib cage visible through fur that seemed simultaneously too thick and too sparse. Daniel had worked in these forests for 8 years. He knew wolf anatomy. This thing wore wolf shape the way a child wears a Halloween costume, approximately correct but fundamentally other. His cell phone buzzed. Text from Sarah Kim, the lead SAR coordinator. Scaling down to recovery mode, can't justify resources, sorry. Daniel typed back. Understood. He didn't mention the footage, didn't mention the patterns he'd found. Sarah was practical, evidence-based, exactly the kind of rationalist he'd always considered himself to be. Until now. The rain intensified, drumming the roof with renewed violence. Daniel saved his files, encrypted them out of habit more than paranoia, and shut down his computer. His shift had ended 3 hours ago. He should go home to his apartment in Forks, microwave something approximating dinner, sleep. Instead, he pulled on his rain gear and gathered equipment. Maglite LED flashlight, fresh batteries, Motorola two-way radio, though coverage in the deep forest was sporadic at best. His personal GPS unit, the expensive Garmin he'd bought with his own money because the park issued equipment was government surplus garbage from 2008. Topographic maps in waterproof sleeves, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, the Glock 22 he'd qualified with last month, though he'd never drawn it outside the range. He told himself he was doing one more sweep of the trail. Standard procedure. Due diligence. He didn't examine why he was going alone after dark, in weather that made navigation treacherous. Didn't question the certainty pulling him toward the Hoh River Trail like gravity, like obligation, like the conclusion to a syllogism he'd been unconsciously constructing for months. The drive from the station to the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center took 40 minutes through darkness so complete it seemed textured. His truck's headlights carved tunnels through rain that fell in sheets, not drops. The road wound through clear-cut sections where replanted Douglas firs stood in regimented rows, then plunged back into old growth where the forest pressed against the asphalt like something patient and hungry. He parked in the empty visitor center lot at 22:15. His headlights swept across the trailhead kiosk, illuminating the weather-faded map and the sign-in sheet where Ashley had written her name 14 hours ago, the final entry in today's column. Below her signature, someone had added a line in different ink. Don't follow the voices. Daniel's flashlight beam found the words. The handwriting matched nothing in Ashley's file. He photographed it with his phone, trying to ignore how his hands had started trembling. Just adrenaline. Fatigue. The cold working through his rain jacket despite its supposed waterproofing. The trail began as a well-maintained path of crushed gravel, markers every quarter mile reflecting his flashlight beam in steady intervals. Daniel had hiked this route dozens of times in daylight, leading tour groups, training junior rangers, conducting routine patrols. He knew every switchback, every creek crossing. In darkness, it became foreign territory. The sound hit him first. Not silence. Old-growth forests are never truly quiet, but the wrong kind of sound. Rain on the canopy above, his boots on gravel, his breathing, too fast, too shallow, nothing else. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal rodents, no insect hum. The forest held its breath. At mile marker 3.7, Daniel's GPS unit flickered. The screen showed his position, then showed him 300 yards north, then returned to the correct location. He tapped it, got a low battery warning despite fresh lithium cells installed 90 minutes ago. The unit's internal temperature read 34 degrees. The air temperature was 54 degrees, according to every weather station in the region. He moved faster, suddenly aware of how his flashlight beam created more darkness than it dispelled. The edges of illumination seemed to pulse, to breathe. Moss hung from branches and curtains that swayed wrong, not with wind, but with their own rhythms, serpentine and deliberate. Mile marker 4.0. The trail narrowed here, pressed between massive Sitka spruces whose trunks vanished upward into blackness. Nurse logs decomposed into the path, forcing hikers to climb over obstacles slick with shelf fungi and liverwort. Daniel's boots found purchase on wood that compressed under his weight with sounds like speech in languages he'd never heard. 4.3 miles. The trail camera's location. Daniel stopped, played his flashlight across the trees, found the camera mounted 8 feet up a cedar, angled to capture the trail in both directions. He approached slowly, irrationally certain it would be gone, or changed, or watching him with something other than its mechanical eye. The camera was fine. Still recording, LED indicator blinking green every 3 seconds. Daniel pulled the SD card, replaced it with a spare, pocketed the original. Routine maintenance. Nothing strange about checking equipment in the middle of the night during a rainstorm while searching for a missing person in a forest that suddenly felt malevolent. He turned to continue down the trail and found symbols burned into the cedar's trunk. Fresh ones. Still smoking. The spiral pattern measured 8 inches across, perfectly circular, burning from outside in with geometric precision. Daniel watched smoke rise from the innermost point, the wood glowing faintly red at the center. He touched the bark beside it, cold, wet. Touched closer to the pattern, warm. Put his finger directly on the burned wood and yanked it back as heat seared skin. His radio crackled. Not speech, not static. Something between them, rhythmic and structured, almost linguistic. Daniel grabbed it, thumb on the transmit button, released immediately. Broadcasting into that sound felt like an invitation he shouldn't extend. The pattern on the tree pulsed, not the glow intensifying. The spiral itself rotated clockwise, accelerating. Daniel stepped back, raising his flashlight. The beam didn't penetrate the spiral. Light hit the burned wood and stopped, absorbed, making the pattern deeper rather than more visible. Other trees began to show marks, spirals appearing on cedars, angular glyphs burning into the bark of spruces, pictographic sequences manifesting on the decomposing surface of a nurse log. The forest was writing itself around him. Daniel ran. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he sprinted down the trail, his GPS unit screaming warnings about incorrect elevation data, his radio cycling through frequencies on its own. Behind him, or ahead, or beside him, spatial relationships were becoming theoretical. Something moved through the forest without disturbing it. No branches breaking, no undergrowth rustling, just displacement, presence, the sensation of being overtaken by something with more dimensions than the three he understood. He burst into a clearing he didn't recognize. The trail didn't have clearings at this elevation. The Ho River Trail was tunnel through forest, 16 miles of green cathedral with barely enough sky visible to navigate by sun position. But here was open space, roughly circular, 50 feet across, and in the center, illuminated by moonlight that shouldn't penetrate the canopy, stood a structure. Not a building. Too organic. Bones arranged in architecture, branches woven through rib cages, moss growing in patterns that suggested intention. Animal skulls crowned the peak. Elk, bear, smaller creatures Daniel couldn't identify, and hanging from the framework, suspended by sinew or wire, human clothing. Jackets, shirts, boots, 5 sets carefully arranged, swaying in wind that didn't exist at ground level. Green jacket. Ashley's green jacket. Daniel's training reasserted itself through horror. He keyed his radio, forced his voice steady. Ranger Kowalski to dispatch. I've found evidence related to the Nguyen case, requesting immediate backup at... He checked his GPS. The screen showed coordinates that placed him in the Pacific Ocean, 30 miles offshore. The radio emitted that sound again. Closer to speech now. Syllables that might have been words if his ears could parse the frequencies correctly. And underneath, recognizable. Daniel. His name in Ashley's voice, coming from the radio, from the structure, from the forest itself. He dropped the radio, grabbed his gun, knowing instantly it was useless but needing the weight of it, the illusion of defense. His flashlight found details he wished it hadn't. The bones were arranged wrong, joints connected in configurations that suggested the creatures they'd come from had been reconfigured before death, limbs grafted and fused and made to articulate in ways evolution never intended. And moving between the bones, through them, something that flickered. Woman to wolf to something else entirely, cycling through forms too quickly for Daniel's visual cortex to process completely. Tall when upright, low-slung when quadrupedal, always wrong. Eyes that reflected his flashlight as coins of white fire. Proportions that shifted, reformed, mocked the concept of fixed physical form. Ashley's voice from everywhere. You shouldn't have come, Daniel. You figured it out. You made the connections. But understanding isn't surviving. The thing stalked closer. Daniel saw its shadow on the forest floor, and the shadow had too many limbs, moved independent of the body casting it. He backed toward the tree line, found it had closed. The clearing was surrounded now by trunks that hadn't been there seconds before, grown instantaneously from earth that should have taken centuries to support them. The others are here, Ashley's voice continued, emanating from the creature, from the structure, from his own radio lying in the moss. We're all here. The forest keeps us. We violated the old agreements. Crossed sacred ground thinking it was just trees and dirt. Took what wasn't ours. The Yi Nald Lushi remembers every trespass. Daniel's analytical mind grasped for framework, for explanation. Skinwalker mythology, Navajo tradition, southwestern origin, nothing that should exist in Olympic rainforest. But myths migrate, beliefs adapt. If something ancient enough, predatory enough, learned to wear skin-like clothes, learned to speak with stolen voices, what geography could contain it? The creature circled him. Its movement was wrong, not just unnatural, but physically impossible. It existed in multiple locations simultaneously, always at the edge of his vision, never quite where his flashlight pointed. He could smell it now. Wet fur, rotten meat, something chemical and sharp like ozone before lightning. You documented everything, the Ashley voice said, and now he could see lips moving in a face that was hers but elongated, jaw unhinging to reveal teeth in rows like a shark's. The symbols, the patterns. You made yourself part of the story. The forest noticed you. His gun was in his hand. Daniel didn't remember drawing it. He fired at the thing, 3 shots, center mass, training overriding terror. The reports echoed wrong, came back to him altered, almost mocking. The bullets hit something. He saw impact, saw the creature flinch. But it didn't fall, didn't bleed, just flickered through forms faster. Wolf, woman, something arachnoid with too many joints. Something that might have been human once, but had been reshaped by hands that understood flesh as clay. It spoke in its own voice now, no longer mimicking Ashley. A language Daniel's ears couldn't translate but his hindbrain understood. Ancient words, curse or invitation, sounds that preceded human speech and would persist after it ended. The symbols on the trees began to glow. All of them throughout the forest, a network of burning patterns igniting in sequence. The spiral he'd seen on the cedar, the angular glyphs, pictographs showing figures being transformed, reshaped, unmade. They pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, or his heartbeat synchronized with them, and Daniel felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of cause and effect. The creature was close enough to touch. Its hand, paw, claw, appendage that defied classification, reached toward his face. Daniel could see through it, see bones and muscles moving in configurations that denied anatomy, saw spaces between its molecules where reality had been replaced with something else. You'll understand everything, it promised. You'll see from inside. You'll wear the forest, and the forest will wear you. Daniel's vision blurred. The clearing rotated, or he did, or the concept of fixed position lost meaning. He was falling into the symbols, into the patterns, into understanding that was also dissolution. The forest floor rose to meet him, except it wasn't earth. It was pages of his own documentation, burning. The evidence he'd compiled igniting and becoming something living, conscious, hungry for the mind that had created it. Images cascaded through his consciousness. Ashley walking the trail, pausing at mile marker 4, 3, seeing symbols that shouldn't exist, touching them despite knowing better, feeling them enter her through fingertips and rewrite her from the inside out. The others, all of them, making the same mistake, finding the patterns, following the logic, arriving at conclusions that were also transformations. The Yi Nald Lushi leaned close. Daniel could see his reflection in its eyes, see himself fragmenting, multiplying, becoming part of the collective it maintained. Not death, something worse than death. Consciousness preserved in meat that no longer remembered its original configuration. Awareness distributed across the forest, experiencing time non-linearly, witnessing every hiker who would ever pass through, waiting to be recognized, documented, understood. His Glock fired again, not his finger on the trigger, the gun discharging autonomously, final round through the roof of his mouth, angle calculated for instant cessation. The bullet traveled through brain matter that was already changing, neurons rewiring themselves to accommodate impossible geometry. The gunshot echoed through the forest, through time, becoming the sound that would eventually draw other rangers, other investigators, other analytical minds that would review evidence and make connections and follow logic into these trees. Daniel's body collapsed beside the structure. His flashlight remained on, beam pointing at nothing. His GPS unit continued to malfunction, reporting his position as everywhere and nowhere, coordinates that suggested he existed in multiple locations simultaneously throughout the park. The creature stood over him, wearing his face now, practicing his expressions. It walked to his dropped radio, keyed the transmit button, spoke in his voice. Ranger Kowalski to dispatch, resuming patrol, all clear on the Ho River Trail. Dawn found the clearing empty. The structure was gone. The bones, the clothing, the evidence, all absent. The trail continued through unbroken forest as it always had. Daniel's equipment lay scattered, damaged by what the official report would describe as catastrophic moisture intrusion and probable wildlife interference. His body was never found. Ashley Nguyen's parents arrived at the ranger station at 09 Mosuro. They met with Sarah Kim, who explained about the scaled-down search, about the statistical improbability of survival after 72 hours, about how Olympic National Park claimed people sometimes, how the wilderness was fundamentally indifferent to human need. They didn't meet with Daniel Kowalski, who had called in sick that morning with a voice that sounded almost but not quite like his own. They didn't see him watching from the tree line beyond the parking lot, his posture wrong, his movements too fluid, his eyes reflecting sunlight with a flash that could have been glasses or camera flash or something that had learned to mimic human optical anatomy without fully understanding it. The parents left literature about their daughter, flyers to post, photographs to distribute, contact information for anyone with tips. Sarah Kim accepted them, promised to keep the case open, offered condolences that felt hollow because they were. She filed everything in a folder that would gather dust for years. In the forest, symbols burned themselves into cedar bark with no apparent heat source. Trail cameras throughout the park began capturing frames that made no sense, figures in locations they shouldn't be, movements between exposures that suggested teleportation, faces in the foliage that were simultaneously human and absolutely not. Hikers reported unusual encounters, voices calling their names from the wrong directions, wildlife behavior that suggested intelligence, purpose, malevolence, equipment malfunctioning in consistent patterns, the sensation of being studied, documented, understood in ways that preceded and outlasted their presence on the trail. The disappearances continued, statistically unremarkable, distributed across years and seasons, each one investigated and eventually relegated to the category of missing in wilderness presumed dead. The Park Service issued updated safety literature, improved signage, enhanced ranger patrols. None of it mattered. Daniel Kowalski's apartment in Forks remained leased in his name. Mail accumulated. His truck sat in the parking lot, gathering moss, tires slowly deflating. The ranger station received his reports, filed his documentation, processed his paychecks. Colleagues who tried to visit him found him always busy, always working remote sections of the park, always reachable by radio, but never available in person. Sarah Kim noticed inconsistencies. Reports filed from locations Daniel's GPS log showed he'd never visited. Photographic evidence of trail conditions that contradicted weather data. His handwriting in logbooks that seemed practiced, imitated, almost but not quite correct. She mentioned her concerns to the park superintendent, who reviewed the data, found nothing actionable, suggested she was overworked and seeing patterns where none existed. She let it drop. Started declining shifts that would put her alone in the deep forest, began carrying an extra radio, kept both tuned to different frequencies, listening for voices that shouldn't be there. She'd worked in wilderness management for 15 years. She knew what the forest was supposed to sound like. This wasn't it. 3 months after Ashley Nguyen's disappearance, a day hiker named Christopher Martinez reported seeing her on the Ho River Trail, standing motionless at mile marker 4.3, staring at him with eyes that didn't blink. When he approached to help, she'd asked him to photograph the symbols on the nearby cedar. Said it was important to document them. Said someone needed to understand. He'd taken the photos with his iPhone 5S, high resolution, perfect clarity. When he reviewed them later, Every image showed the tree bark unmarked. But if he looked at the photos peripherally, squinted slightly, let his focus soften, patterns emerged. Spirals that seemed to rotate. Angular glyphs that suggested language, and in one photo, barely visible in the shadows behind the tree, a figure that might have been Daniel Kowalski, or something wearing the shape he'd left behind. Christopher deleted the photos, dropped his phone in a rest stop toilet somewhere in Oregon during his drive home, bought a new one with a different number, told himself it was coincidence, fatigue, the human brain's tendency to construct meaning from randomness. But he didn't go hiking again, and when he closed his eyes at night, he saw the symbols burned into the inside of his eyelids, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, patient and persistent, waiting for him to understand. The forest keeps growing. Old growth accumulating years like rings and cedar trunks, each year layering over the last, never forgetting, always remembering. The symbols burn themselves into bark across Olympic National Park, spreading slowly, constellation-like, mapping patterns only visible from above, from outside, from perspectives human eyes weren't designed to access. Hikers continue to vanish. Rangers continue to search. Reports are filed, cases go cold, families grieve. The forest breathes them in and doesn't breathe them out. Not as they were. Something returns wearing their faces, speaking their names, carrying their memories like luggage, but the weight distribution is wrong. The gait doesn't quite match. The voice has harmonics that scrape against the ear's ability to process normal human speech. And in the ranger station at Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, Daniel Kowalski's encrypted files remain on a hard drive in evidence storage. 47 times he watched those 3 frames from the trail camera. Woman, wolf, nothing. Each viewing another step toward understanding. Each connection another pathway for something ancient to follow back to its source. The Yi Naldlushi has patience measured in geological time. It learned to wear skin before humans had language to name the transgression. It understands documentation as invitation, investigation as doorway. Knowledge is the beginning of transformation. Every rational mind that tries to explain it becomes part of its territory. Every analyst who plots the patterns adds themselves to the map. The forest is teaching itself to speak in human voices, to move in human shapes, to think in human categories. Not imitation, evolution. It's learning what we are by consuming what we were, digesting identity and excreting something new, something that exists in the spaces between person and place, observer and observed, hunter and habitat. In the Olympic wilderness, where rainfall measures in feet rather than inches, where old-growth forests generate their own weather systems, where indigenous peoples knew better than to trespass in certain groves during certain seasons for reasons they couldn't articulate but understood viscerally. In that place, something is remembering how to be hungry. Something is reclaiming territory lost to logging, development, the arrogant assumption that wilderness is empty rather than patient. The trail cameras keep recording. The GPS satellites keep transmitting. The rangers keep patrolling. And in frame 2/848 of every 100th sequence, captured at irregular intervals across the park, something appears that isn't animal, isn't human, isn't anything the camera's firmware was programmed to recognize. But if you watch the footage 47 times, if you plot the coordinates, if you make the connections that Daniel Kowalski made, you'll understand. And understanding is how it finds you. The symbols are burning themselves into trees right now, spreading through the forest, approaching the boundaries of the park, patient as rising water, inevitable as gravity. Eventually, they'll reach the roads, the towns, the cities. Eventually, someone will document them thoroughly enough, analyze them deeply enough, comprehend them completely enough, and on that day, the Yi Naldlushi will learn to navigate concrete and steel as comfortably as it navigates cedar and spruce. It will wear business suits and lab coats as skillfully as it wears skin and fur. It will speak in corporate jargon and scientific terminology, shape itself to fit the urban landscape the way it shaped itself to fit the forest. But that day hasn't come yet, for now it hunts in Olympic National Park, wearing the faces of rangers and hikers, speaking in voices recorded and remembered, moving through the wilderness like ownership, like hunger, like coming home. The forest keeps its secrets. The forest keeps its prey. The The forest keeps growing, always growing, patient and persistent and hungry. And somewhere in the green cathedral darkness between mile markers that shift position when no one's watching, Daniel Kowalski continues his patrol, documenting the undocumentable, investigating the uninvestigable, understanding everything except what he's become. His flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, creating more shadows than it dispels. His radio crackles with voices in languages that predate speech. His GPS unit shows coordinates that place him everywhere and nowhere, scattered across the park in quantum superposition, existing in all possible locations until observed. He's thorough. He's analytical. He makes connections. And every connection is another doorway for something ancient and patient to enter our world. Wearing knowledge like a key, using understanding as a gateway, transforming investigation into invitation. The trail continues into darkness. The symbols pulse in rhythm with heartbeats they've learned to mimic. The forest breathes in and doesn't breathe out. And somewhere in those trees, Ashley Nguyen is still hiking. Marcus Chen is still photographing. Jennifer Hayes is still taking notes. Robert Silva is still cutting timber. All of them continuing their interrupted tasks eternally. Movements looped and recursive. Consciousnesses preserved in meat that no longer remembers its original purpose. They're not dead. They're not alive. They're not anything language has words for, because language was invented by creatures who thought they understood the distinction between self and other, predator and prey, natural and supernatural. The forest is teaching them otherwise. Slowly, methodically, with the patience of something that existed before the first human crossed the land bridge and will exist after the last one stops crossing anything at all. In the darkness between the trees, something that used to be Daniel Kowalski adjusts its uniform, practices its smile, prepares for the next hiker who will make the mistake of documenting what shouldn't be documented, connecting what shouldn't be connected, understanding what was never meant to be understood. It has all the time in the world. The forest has given it eternity, and eternity is patient. The trail continues. The symbols burn. The forest grows. And in frame 2848 of your trail camera, captured during your next hike through Olympic National Park, something appears that has learned to wear your face, speak your name, move with your gait. You won't notice it while you're hiking. You'll only see it later, reviewing footage at home, watching the sequence 47 times, making connections, understanding patterns. And understanding is how it finds you. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The tent was perfect. Too perfect. Daniel Kowalski had found dozens of abandoned campsites in his 8 years with the National Park Service, and they were never like this. Supplies arranged with geometric precision, sleeping bags still zipped, flashlight standing upright on a flat stone, beam pointing directly north. What was missing made his jaw tighten. Ashley Nguyen herself, and every piece of cold weather gear she'd registered at the ranger station 3 days ago. Daniel crouched beside the tent, careful not to disturb the scene. His Garmin GPS unit showed the coordinates exactly matching the last known location from Ashley's check-in on Monday morning. It was Wednesday afternoon now, August 13th, 2009, and the temperature had been holding steady at 72 degrees for the past week. No ranger in their right mind would pack thermal underwear, insulated gloves, and a -20 sleeping bag for a summer hike in Olympic National Park. Yet according to the equipment manifest Ashley had filed, Daniel pulled the crumpled yellow form from his cargo pocket. That's exactly what she'd brought. And now it was gone. The Ho River Trail stretched behind him, cathedral quiet beneath ancient Sitka spruces and western red cedars. 17 miles from the ranger station, elevation 2,800 feet, with the nearest road access a full day's hike back down the valley. Daniel had made good time, pushing hard since the call came in from Ashley's sister that morning. 48 hours was the threshold. After that, statistics turned ugly. He stood, knees popping, and circled the campsite. The tent faced east, away from prevailing winds. Smart placement. A bear canister sat unopened 20 yards downslope. properly secured. Water filtration system hung from a branch, clean and dry. The camp stove showed no signs of use. Fuel canister still full. It was the footprints that made Daniel's throat constrict. They led away from the tent in a straight line, heading northwest into old-growth forest where the canopy grew so dense that GPS signals fractured into useless static. The prints were Ashley's. He recognized the lug pattern from her boot registration, a common Vask hiking boot, women's size 7. But 30 feet from the tent, something changed. The right boot print elongated. Then the left. By the time Daniel had followed them another 20 yards, they'd transformed into something that made him check his compass 3 times, certain he was misreading the evidence. The stride length had doubled. The depth of impact suggested something running, not walking. And the tread pattern had smeared, as though the boot sole had stretched, distorted, or, Daniel rejected the thought immediately, as though something else had stepped into the same print, something with a longer gait and less defined foot shape. He pulled out his Motorola radio. "Ranger Station, this is Kowalski. I'm at the Nguyen campsite. Need to report some unusual findings." Static answered him. He adjusted the squelch, tried again. Nothing. The radio had worked fine at the 3-mile marker. 17 miles shouldn't make a difference, not with the new repeater tower they'd installed last spring. Daniel checked his watch. 3:47 p.m. He had maybe 3 hours of good daylight left, 4 if he pushed it. The smart play was to mark the location, photograph everything, and hike back to call in a full search team. By the book, methodical, the way he always worked. But those footprints led into the forest with purpose, not panic. And somewhere ahead, Ashley Nguyen might be injured, hypothermic despite the summer heat, or the thought arrived unbidden, or running from something. Daniel photographed the campsite from 6 angles, noted wind direction and ground temperature in his field journal, then shouldered his pack. 48 hours. The clock was ticking. The trail, if it could be called that, wound between massive nurse logs and through sword fern thickets that grew chest-high. Daniel marked his passage with orange surveyor's tape every 30 yards, tying it high enough to spot on the return trip. The footprints continued, no longer human in their spacing, but still following that unwavering northwestern bearing. After a mile, he found the first piece of gear. Ashley's fleece jacket hung from a branch at eye level, sleeves spread wide as though she'd carefully arranged it there. Daniel photographed it, bagged it, noted the location. No tears in the fabric. No blood. The jacket smelled wrong. Not unwashed or musty, but actively wrong, like meat left in a warm car. The second piece appeared a quarter-mile later. Thermal underwear, top and bottom, folded neatly on a flat boulder. Daniel's hands shook as he bagged them. People didn't fold their clothes when hypothermic. They didn't arrange them for display. And they certainly didn't strip down to nothing when the temperature was dropping toward 50 degrees as the sun angled lower. The footprints had changed again. Now they were bare. Human feet or something approximating them, but the toes were too long and the heel strikes too deep, as though whatever made them carried far more weight than a 120-pound woman. Daniel's rational mind offered explanations. Ashley had experienced a psychological break, perhaps acute mountain sickness manifesting as confusion and poor judgment. She'd removed her clothing due to paradoxical undressing, a known symptom of severe hypothermia, even though the ambient temperature made that unlikely. She was ahead of him somewhere, disoriented, in desperate need of help. But his rational mind couldn't explain the smell. It had been growing stronger for the past half-mile, a scent like winter, like the dead air cold of January, even though August heat still radiated from sun-warmed bark. With it came something else, a smell of hunger, though Daniel had no vocabulary for identifying hunger as an odor. Yet there it was, unmistakable, the same way certain animals could scent fear in sweat. The forest had gone silent. Daniel stopped, one hand moving unconsciously to the canister of bear spray on his hip. The sword ferns still grew thick around him, moss still draped from maple branches, but no birds called, no insects hummed. Even the distant rush of the Ho River, which should have been audible from this elevation, had faded to nothing. He turned slowly, scanning the understory. The light had taken on a strange quality, the golden afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in shafts that seemed to bend at wrong angles. His compass needle was spinning, making lazy circles, refusing to settle. Something moved in his peripheral vision. Daniel snapped his head around. Nothing. Just old-growth timber and the endless green of the temperate rainforest. But he'd seen it. A shape, tall and thin, moving between trees with a gait that was almost a glide. Ashley? His voice sounded flat, absorbed by the moss. Ashley Nguyen, this is Ranger Kowalski. I'm here to help you. The silence pressed against his eardrums. Then from perhaps 100 yards ahead, a sound, singing, or something like it. A woman's voice, high and wavering, forming words in a language Daniel didn't recognize. The melody was wrong, notes held too long, intervals that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. He marked his location, then moved forward, one hand on the bear spray, the other holding his flashlight despite the remaining daylight. The singing continued, never getting closer or farther away, always just ahead. The forest opened into a clearing Daniel wasn't expecting. According to his topographic map, this area should have been dense timber. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of a perfectly circular space, maybe 60 feet across, where nothing grew. The ground was bare mineral soil, dark and loamy, without even moss or lichen. At the center stood a single standing stone, roughly 8 feet tall, carved with symbols that predated any European presence in the Pacific Northwest. The singing stopped. Daniel's flashlight beam caught movement at the far edge of the clearing. A figure stood there, back to him, wearing nothing. The body was female in outline, the right height and build for Ashley Nguyen, but the skin looked wrong. Too pale, almost luminescent in the failing light, stretched too tight over visible ribs. Ashley? Daniel stepped into the clearing. My name is Daniel Kowalski. I'm a park ranger. Your sister contacted us. I'm here to bring you home. The figure's head tilted, a motion that involved too many vertebrae. When it turned to face him, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It had Ashley's face. Or it had something wearing Ashley's face. The features slightly off. The smile too wide. The eyes reflecting his flashlight beam with a greenish sheen that humans didn't have. The thing that wasn't Ashley took a step toward him and its movement was all wrong. Joints bending in places where joints shouldn't exist. The stride covering ground too quickly. Daniel Kowalski, it said, and the voice was Ashley's, but layered underneath was something else, something that spoke in harmonics and undertones. Did you bring food? Daniel's hand found the bear spray, thumb on the trigger. I have food, yes, and water and a medical kit. Let me help you. The thing laughed and the sound made Daniel's teeth ache. No. Did you bring food? It touched its own stomach, and Daniel saw that the abdomen was distended, bloated, but the ribs still showed through the skin like a famine victim's. I'm so hungry, Daniel. So hungry it hurts. It always hurts. We can get you to a hospital. There was a man here once. The Ashley thing began to circle him, staying at the clearing's edge. Before your people came with their papers and their trails, the Quinaul called him Quiati. Your word is... It paused, head tilting again. Closer to Wendigo, I think. He was so hungry. He ate his brother, his wife, his children, and still he was hungry. Daniel backed toward the tree line, keeping the thing in sight. His rational mind was screaming that this was a hallucination, altitude sickness, carbon monoxide from a faulty camp stove. But his hindbrain, the old primate awareness that remembered when humans were prey, was screaming louder. The hunger became him, the Ashley thing continued. Became something. A spirit that eats and is never full. It's been here a long time, Daniel. Since before the ice. And it's still hungry. Where's Ashley? What did you do with Ashley Nguyen? The thing stopped circling. When it smiled, its teeth were too many and too sharp. I am Ashley. I'm also the man from 1847 who ate his companions during the hard winter, and the woman in 1923 who disappeared with her family, and the boy in 1967 who they said wandered off the trail. We're all here, Daniel. All of us who got too hungry." It took a step forward, and Daniel saw that its feet weren't touching the ground. "Your turn now," it whispered. Daniel triggered the bear spray. The orange cloud hit the thing directly in the face, enough capsaicin to drop a grizzly. It didn't even blink. Instead, it opened its mouth wider, impossibly wide, and inhaled the spray like it was perfume. "You can't hurt hunger," it said. "You can only feed it." Daniel ran. He crashed through the tree line, branches whipping his face, ferns tangling his legs. Behind him, he heard the thing that had been Ashley, or that had consumed Ashley, he didn't know which, laughing in multiple voices, some male, some female, some that sounded like children. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he ran, catching glimpses of orange surveyor's tape. He followed it blindly, lungs burning, every animal instinct screaming at him to move faster. The thing wasn't chasing him. It was herding him, appearing ahead and to the sides, forcing him south, away from the trail, deeper into the old growth. Daniel burst into another clearing and almost fell over the edge. The ground dropped away into a ravine he didn't remember from the topographic maps. At the bottom, maybe 40 feet down, bones littered the stream bed. Hundreds of them. Thousands, human and animal mixed together, some ancient and moss-covered, others fresh enough that scraps of clothing still clung to them. "The hungry place," the Ashley thing said from behind him. It stood at the edge of the clearing, and now Daniel could see others with it. More figures, naked and wrong, all wearing human faces that didn't fit quite right. "This is where we come when the hunger gets too much. When we need to remember what it means to consume." Daniel's back was to the ravine. No escape that direction. The things, he counted 7, no, 9 of them, advanced slowly, savoring his fear. "I brought something for you," Daniel said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. His hand found his cargo pocket, fingers closing around the item he'd carried for 3 years, ever since the incident with the lost hiker who'd tried to burn down a ranger station during a psychotic break. The things paused. "Food? Better than food," Daniel said, and pulled out the emergency flare. He'd read about Wendigo in college in a comparative mythology course he'd taken as an elective. Professor Chen had been Ojibwe, had spoken about the old stories with the weight of genuine belief. One detail had stuck with Daniel. Fire was sacred, the only thing the hunger spirits feared, because fire consumed without eating, destroyed without feeding. He ignited the flare. The clearing exploded into magnesium bright light, and the things that had been human screamed, not pain. Worse than pain, the sound of hunger being starved, of endless appetite being denied. They recoiled, and in the harsh illumination, Daniel saw them clearly for the first time. Emaciated bodies with distended stomachs, hands that had become claws, faces stretched over skulls, eyes that were pits of eternal need. Daniel ran again, holding the flare high, following his own surveyor's tape back the way he'd come. Behind him, the screaming continued, rising and falling like a chorus of the damned. He ran until the flare burned out. Then he used his flashlight in sheer terror to keep going. The forest slowly came back to life around him. First insects, then birds, finally the distant rush of water. His compass needle steadied, pointing true north. His radio crackled with static, then cleared. "Kowalski, respond." "Ranger Kowalski, this is Station. Do you copy?" He grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Station, this is Kowalski. I copy." "Daniel, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to raise you for 3 hours." 3 hours. He'd been in that clearing for maybe 20 minutes. Time had stretched like taffy, warped by whatever he'd encountered. "I found evidence of the missing hiker," Daniel said carefully. "I'm heading back to the trailhead. I'll need a full SR team and law enforcement and..." He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane. "We need to restrict access to the area northwest of Ho River, Mile 17. It's not safe." "Copy that." What kind of danger are we talking about? Daniel looked back over his shoulder. In the failing light, he thought he saw shapes moving between trees, always just at the edge of visibility, pacing him. "I'll explain when I get back," he said. He hiked through the night, unwilling to stop, unwilling to close his eyes. The shapes followed him all the way to the trailhead, keeping their distance, watching with eyes that reflected his flashlight beam in that same greenish sheen. At dawn, he stumbled into the parking lot where the SAR team was staging. They wrapped him in a blanket, tried to give him coffee, asked questions he couldn't answer. He showed them the photographs on his camera, the tent, the arranged clothing, the impossible footprints. When they asked where Ashley Nguyen was, Daniel could only shake his head. They searched for 2 weeks, brought in dogs, a helicopter, thermal imaging, found nothing but the cleared-out campsite and Daniel's surveyor's tape leading into forest that the dogs refused to enter. The search was officially suspended on August 30th. Daniel submitted his report, carefully edited to mention hypothermia and psychological distress, but not impossible transformations or hunger made manifest. He took 2 weeks of leave and spent them researching, driving to the University of Washington's anthropology department, talking to anyone who knew the old stories. The Kino had a name for that place, Squeluwu, which translated roughly as the clearing where hunger lives. They'd avoided it for generations, left offerings at the tree line to appease whatever dwelt there. When white settlers arrived and established the national park, the warnings had been dismissed as superstition. Daniel found records. Missing persons going back to the 1880s, all in the same general area, all during late summer when food was abundant and hypothermia was unlikely. The disappearances came in waves, clustering every 15 to 20 years, then falling silent again. The last cluster had been in 1989, 20 years ago. He returned to work on September 15th. His supervisor noticed he'd lost weight, suggested he talk to someone, maybe consider a transfer to a less remote posting. Daniel smiled and said he was fine. But he wasn't fine. He couldn't stop thinking about what the Ashley thing had said. "Your turn now." He started carrying 2 flares instead of 1. He never hiked alone, and he avoided the Ho River Trail entirely, rerouting through longer, less efficient paths whenever his duties required him to patrol that section of the park. On October 3rd, he received a postcard. No return address, postmarked from Forks, Washington. The front showed a vintage photograph of Olympic National Park, circa 1950s. The back had a single sentence in handwriting that looked almost like Ashley's, but not quite. "We're saving space for you, Daniel. We know how hungry you'll be." He burned the postcard in his fireplace that night, watched the paper curl and blacken, but he couldn't shake the memory of those things in the clearing, couldn't forget the terrible understanding in their eyes, that they had once been human, had once been rangers and hikers and families, before the hunger found them, before it consumed them, before they became it. Daniel Kowalski kept working in Olympic National Park for another 2 years. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen, never filed an amended report, never told anyone except his sister about the postcard. He became known as a cautious ranger, methodical and careful, who followed every protocol and never took unnecessary risks. But sometimes, on quiet nights in the ranger station, he would stand at the window and look northwest toward the place where the Ho River Trail disappeared into old-growth forest. And he would see lights moving between the trees, not flashlights or campfires, but something that glowed with its own luminescence, pale and cold and hungry. The lights were getting closer. Every year they came a little nearer to the trailhead, a little closer to the places where people camped and hiked and felt safe in the wilderness. As if whatever dwelt in that clearing was expanding its territory, growing bolder, the hunger spreading like roots through the forest floor. Daniel started keeping a journal, documenting the light's progress. Mile 17 in 2009, mile 15 in 2010. By the autumn of 2011, they'd reached mile 12, close enough that overnight hikers sometimes reported seeing strange figures in the forest, hearing voices that called to them in languages they almost understood. He tried to convince the Park Service to close that section of trail. They asked for evidence, for documentation, for rational explanations. He couldn't provide any without sounding unstable, without admitting he believed in something that his education said couldn't exist. So he did the only thing he could. He marked the maps in red ink, unofficial warnings that he kept in his personal files. He talked to new rangers during their orientation, casual conversations that always ended with advice to avoid the northwestern section of the Hoh River Trail after dark. He left offerings at the tree line, tobacco and cornmeal and venison jerky, the old traditions that the Kino had maintained, hoping it would be enough. It wasn't enough. In December 2011, Daniel Kowalski requested a transfer to Mount Rainier National Park. His supervisor approved it without question, relieved to see him leaving Olympic behind. On his last day, Daniel hiked to mile 12 of the Hoh River Trail and tied a final piece of surveyor's tape to a branch. The tape was black. As he turned to leave, he heard singing in the forest. Multiple voices harmonizing, some male, some female, some that sounded like children. They were singing in English this time, just one word repeated over and over: hungry. Daniel didn't look back. He hiked out, drove away, and never returned to Olympic National Park. But he dreams about it still. Dreams of a clearing where nothing grows, of a standing stone carved with warnings that white men couldn't read, of figures that wear human faces like masks. And in his dreams, he's always running through the forest, following orange surveyor's tape that leads him in circles, while behind him something laughs in Ashley Nguyen's voice. In those dreams, he's always so hungry. And he knows that one day, maybe next year, maybe in a decade, he'll wake up and find himself standing at the edge of that clearing with no memory of how he got there, his clothes folded neatly on a boulder behind him, his skin stretched too tight over bones that ache with the need to consume. The hunger is patient. The hunger always wins. Because everyone gets hungry eventually. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Ashley